There is no sound coming through.
Let's have a look. Oh no.
Captured a great look.
Yeah. Is that not coming through? Is that coming through now?
It's on pause right now.
Let's have a look.
No, I can't hear it, Jake.
What's different tonight to yesterday? This is so annoying. Right, let's have a look. If I cross that off.
And I know if I'm not done, you can just pause it. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds perfect. If you can still hear me.
All right. All right. So here we go. So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about powerful teaching, unleashing the science of learning. So what is powerful teaching? For me, it started back in 2006. At that time, the way we learned about the science of learning was through research that was done in the United States at universities, in laboratories, with college students. Well, that changed in 2006 when two cognitive scientists, Dr. Henry Roediger III and Dr. Mark McDaniel, who were studying how people learn, wrote a large grant with the idea of what if we studied how students learn in an authentic classroom. And so they got this large grant, and the authentic classroom was mine. And so I started doing research with them. And Pooja Agarwal was a cognitive scientist. They were all from Washington University here in St. Louis, Missouri. And so Pooja came to my classroom every day, and we started studying how people learn, and it became powerful teaching. So the next slide that is up is a wonderful quote by Tricia Taylor, which is exploring retrieval from an article, Exploring Retrieval with Younger Students. Oops, can you go back there?
Yeah, Patrice, what I'm going to say is, what I'll do, I'll pause it, and then when you tell me you're done, on just tell me to. I'll be the forward button. Is that all right? So if you
all
just
right.
Tell that
so now I need you to be my back button.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's have a look. Let me just cross this off. I think. Yes, that's good. That didn't ruin anything. So there we go. How's that?
All right. So Tricia's quote was, waiting until secondary school to teach children how to improve their memories contributes to widening the knowledge gap between the haves and the have-nots. By the time students reach secondary school, the children who started behind in primary school will be even further behind. We can change this. We now have the knowledge at our fingertips of how to teach students how to learn. Next slide. So a question I wanted to ask was, what is your comfort level with cognitive science? Next. I was on Naylor's Natters, and a quote was, cognitive science is nothing to be scared of. For many of us, just the term cognitive science seems so overwhelming, but it's readily available to us. Next. I felt like I should have sung Naylor's Natters when that came up. There is
rewind, Patrice. Yeah.
There is valuable research on the science of learning out there sitting behind lock and key until now. It is here, it is now, it's ready for us. Next. every single school year since I started back in 2006 with the research was on that first day saying, I'm your teacher and I am going to teach you how to learn. In fact, to me, that is so important. That is going to be my primary focus. My curriculum is second, but first, I am going to teach you how to learn. And before, when we were chatting beforehand, I told a little story about how sometimes it's those students who tend to struggle a little bit, who it's almost like it had been a party and they had not been invited, that there was this knowledge that some people knew and they never got how to learn. So for us to be able to be explicit and really help our students understand just unlocks the world of learning. Next. So how do we learn? Next. There are 3 steps. And the first step is encoding. And as teachers, we excel. This is what we do. Encoding is getting information into our students' heads. We might lecture, we might show clips, we might do PowerPoints, we might read. There's so many, right? But that is that first step, encoding, getting that information in. Next. And the second step is storage. That information is in our students' heads. And too often, that's where our teacher preparation has ended. We learn how to give the information. We learn that it's in our students' heads, but that's not enough. Next, Pooja has a great quote that says, too often we focus on getting the information in. What if instead we focused on getting the information out? And that is the third step of learning. Next, and that is retrieval. So, various times I'll do some power-ups or some strategies. If this were my class right now, I might do choral work, a turn and talk, stop and jot, write it down. If virtual, do a breakout room. But I would ask, and you can click, what are the 3 steps of learning? And having your students, having whoever you're working with be able to retrieve that information is paramount. So what are the 3 steps? Say it out loud. Encoding, storage, retrieval. Next. So in the book, Powerful Teaching, we discuss how to increase learning through power tools. Next. So what are power tools? Power tools are those research principles that are absolutely powerful because they will boost learning and help with memory retention. And what are those power tools? Retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, and feedback-driven metacognition. Next. Why do we love power tools? They're not new. It's very likely you're already using many of these. You just maybe didn't know it had a name. But they're also not a fad. Too often, I found as a teacher that it was almost like a fad of the semester club. Here's this new shiny object. Here's this new gadget. Try this. I heard somebody speak and they had this great idea. Let's do that. Kind of like learning styles, remember? These are not fads, but they are based in research. And these principles, these power tools work for all content and ages, and how you can just make a small shift and it will make a big difference for your students. Next. So let's start talking about them. The first one is retrieval. The first power tool, retrieval. And what is it? Pulling information out. Next. This is retrieval. We do it all the time. We think about, remember when we used to be able to go out with friends, that fun that we had, or the family lore stories or vacations? This is retrieval. It is pulling information that we have stored, pulling it out. Next. So why is it that these are the looks that we get from our students when we ask them to retrieve? Next. Why is it that they feel such anxiety when this is something that we really like to do? Next. There's a reason for it. It happens when retrieval is infrequent, and it happens when retrieval is high stakes. Think about this for a minute. Think about times that you taught something, but there isn't an opportunity for retrieval until a test at the end of the year. When it's infrequent, or it hasn't been retrieved until this high stakes test, that's what causes anxiety. Next. So 1,500 high school students who were using retrieval were asked, does retrieval make you more or less anxious for unit tests? Look at this. And why? Because when you use these power tools, when you use retrieval throughout the course of study, your students are so prepared. In fact, in my classroom, when it came time for that big stakes test, I called them celebrations. It wasn't anxiety producing. Instead, let's celebrate all you now know about this subject, this topic. When you bring students along with you, they're ready and anxiety goes down. Next. Remember, retrieval practice is a learning strategy, not an assessment strategy. Yes, you're still going to be grading those big tests, the essays, there's still that. But the everyday retrieval, the spacing, these are learning strategies. You do not need to grade them. If you must, have it very low stakes. Next. Simple shift. Oops, go back. Rather than say, when you get up in front, this is what we did yesterday. This is what we did last week. Making that small shift to saying, what did we do yesterday? What did we do last week? Turn and talk to your neighbor. Let's do a group share. Within about 90 seconds, you have a retrieval-rich classroom. And this is what we want, that simple shift. Next. Just because you see something does not mean you know it. For example, think about a coin that you have seen hundreds of times, maybe even thousands of times. What does it look like? Could you sketch it? Could you draw and have everything where it needs to be? Something that I like to do when I give presentations in the United States is next. Which one is the real penny? We use pennies in the United States. People have seen hundreds and possibly thousands. Yet almost every single time, people have to really take a look at those. Where does the year appear? Exactly what words are on there? Just because you see something doesn't mean you know it. Next. I say this because so many of the study strategies that our students use are kind of like those coins. They see it, but it doesn't mean they know it. When you are rereading, often when you're taking notes, sometimes just highlighting and underlining, when you are simply rereading these things, you're not retrieving. There are ways we now know that can make studying efficient and effective. Let's keep going. What are retrieval guidelines? Keep it low or no stakes. Ask a mix of questions from simple recall to critical thinking questions. Click once more, the more the better, and you don't need to grade them. Next. So time to ponder. In your classroom, do you have your students review? Or do you have them retrieve? Next. Our second power tool is spacing. And what is spacing but retrieval over time? It's when we revisit information. Now, you've worked all day and now you are dedicating your time to this tonight. You are a great teacher. And you're probably thinking, every teacher in my school I know reviews information. They probably do. But there's an efficient and effective way to do it. Next slide. Have you ever, I know I would, at times, ask students something that they had learned? You know they learned it the year before. You know they did. It's in the curriculum. Or perhaps you taught it earlier in the year and you asked them, you were in the room, you were there, you know they heard it, and you ask the question and you get these looks from students, clueless. Why is that? Next. Spiraling versus spacing. Just because something is in your curriculum does not mean it is being spaced. Students may learn something in 3rd grade and again in 4th grade and again in 5th grade. And at the beginning of 6th grade, you ask those questions and you still get those looks. Just because it is in the curriculum doesn't mean it has been spaced. We need to figure out, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, what information to revisit and when. Next. So what should be spaced? I always like to start with the end. So I would take a look, what are my tests? What are my essays? What are my essential questions? And then I would work backwards because I know I would call those my big ticket items. Those are the things that I need to space out over the course of study. Next. Spacing also is not cramming. What is cramming? Those times you pull an all-nighter the night before a test. I've done it. You may have done it. And why do we do it? Because actually it works, but it only works in the short term. You may get a great score that next day, but a week later, it's gone. We as teachers spend so much time teaching. Don't we want our students to remember what we're teaching? We don't want them to be cramming the night before only to do well on a test, only to forget it all. Spacing is key. Next. There's something called the forgetting curve. And spacing has a lot to do with that forgetting curve. Because what we want to do, as soon as we learn something, we start forgetting it. But what happens, there is like this perfect storm of opportunity that just as we're getting ready to forget it, boom, that's we're going to bring it back. And that's what is going to make that memory stronger. Next. How do I do it? I would do it in things like a blast from the past. When I knew that day that I was talking about a big ticket item, I would go ahead in my lesson plan book and just jot myself a note. Be sure and ask about whatever. It was there. When I got to that day, I knew that I would simply say to my class, hey, blast from the past. Remember when we talked about, what was that? Quick, write down an answer. Share it with a neighbor. And then move on. You have brought that information back to mind and helped them retrieve. You could also do this through entrance and exit tickets. What you want to remember is create that optimal time. Usually after learning something, several days later, I would bring it up, and then perhaps a week later, and then perhaps a couple weeks. So by the time that big test came at the end of the year, they could so easily retrieve that information. Next. What are spacing guidelines? Just always make sure that you bring up the past content. Ask them. Have them retrieve it. Don't tell them, oh, well, when we talked about, we discussed, ask them, have them retrieve. And the more, the better. Next. Power tool number 3. We've had retrieval, spacing, now interleaving. And what is interleaving but mixing up similar content? It improves discrimination. A quick little story that was not in the video, but Dr. Roediger and Dr. McDaniel, in their fabulous book, Make It Stick, talked about being a coach of softball or baseball. And they talked about, you know, when you have a pitcher throwing balls and a batter hitting, there's different ways to do it. You could throw 10 fastballs, 10 curveballs, 10 slow balls. The batter is always going to know what's coming, right? But when you instruct the pitcher to switch it up so the batter doesn't know what's coming, from the time that ball leaves the pitcher's hand, that batter has to think about every strategy that they know to discriminate how to hit that ball. That's interleaving. Next. Here is a study that I want to talk about, blocking versus interleaving. Now, blocking is when you do a chapter and you move on to another chapter. In this study, I'm going to be talking about math. This is with 4th graders. And they did X amount of problems, say addition, and then say you do 10 problems subtraction, and you do 10 problems division. You know, what happens is the students master that block. But what if you interleave it and you put in a couple of this kind of problems and that problem, a couple more here? The students have to start discriminating like that batter. What do they need to know to solve that problem? Next. And keep it here just for a minute.
Okay.
So with these 4th graders, some of them did blocking and some did interleaving. Blocking, all the same. Interleaving, interspersed. And then they were given a quiz at the end of class. And you can see those who had blocked got 100%. They were in the rhythm. They've got it, right? And those who were interleaving, at the end of class, they were still kind of trying to figure out. But 24 hours later, they had another quiz, and take a look. Isn't that really amazing? It's kind of like when we cram for those tests. Yeah, our students are going to know it right away. But is that the purpose? So they can score well right away and then poof, it's gone? Or do we want our students to retain information? Next. So in your class, are you interleaving or are you blocking information? A science teacher I worked with used to teach a chapter on mitosis. And she decided she wanted to switch it up. And so she taught half of it during plant reproduction and then another part during animal reproduction. Same amount of time. It was just where she put it in. The results were phenomenal. Students did so much better on tests, on essays, on drawings. There's one more that you can switch here.
There it is. Yeah.
So when I taught history, being able to teach instead of one ancient river civilization and then another, teaching my ancient river civilizations and having students be able to pick out, or when I was teaching revolutions, instead of teaching one thing and never going back to it again, interspersing, interleaving. So think about your teaching. How can you take similar topics and go ahead and combine them to interleave? Next.
Wow, you talked a lot about blocking and interleaving. Hang on, let me press play. Oh, is that next one? Is that back?
I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But that's okay. No, we missed metacognition. There we go.
Yeah.
So I love metacognition. My students would call me Mrs. Metacognition. This is one of my favorites. Because too often, well, what is metacognition? It's thinking about thinking. And too often, like here we go. You can go on, like where you were. Yeah. You might have students who say, I studied so hard last night, I'm going to ace this test. And they come in and go ahead and click, but they don't. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why for that. And it's because too often students study what they already know because it feels better. I know this, I don't know that, I'll ignore it, I know this. And it builds up this illusion of confidence that they're going to do well. But they don't. Too often, we don't give our students an opportunity to test what they know versus what they don't know before that high stakes test. Next. So, in my 15 plus years of working with researchers, the research, those 4 power principles were powerful. But I felt my job was to come up to develop strategies based on those principles, based on retrieval and spacing and interleaving and feedback-driven metacognition. So let me show you some. First of all, no need to take any notes because everything I'm going to talk about, there are free templates, downloads at powerfulteaching.org at resources. Okay, let's go. So, quizzes. Quizzes are great. I love quizzes. I gave them almost every day. Next. But mine were mini quizzes. They were on 2-inch by 3-inch pieces of recycled paper. I had 180 students. That's 180 students every day. And I was one that, boy, when I gave homework, they were going to have it back the next day so we could go over it. I would spend 2 hours at least every night grading papers. the students only wanted to look at the grade. They didn't want the feedback. Often I would see them in the trash. And I realized that my students had mastered doing homework. They knew how to read a question, look up an answer, write it down, and repeat. There was no retrieval going on. So I started what I call these mini quizzes. And I took from homework, from what we discussed in class, I simply wrote them down on little pieces of paper, cut them up, and stuck them in a basket. And I would begin class the next day with a mini quiz, giving out these small sheets of paper. They'd number 1 through 5. And I would randomly pick out 5. Read them. They would put in an answer. They would send it up. My 2 hours of doing homework at night turned into a 15-minute analysis after school. They knew I was looking at them. There was accountability, but they also had feedback. Do I know this? Do I not? Is this something I need to focus upon? And I noticed that my students started listening differently. They were actually listening because they knew what we discussed would be on a quiz for them to retrieve. You'll see BBQs also written down there. So at the end of the day, again, I knew my big ticket items. I would just dump out all the clues, and I knew, oh, this one is going to be for a big ticket. Oh, this one is. I would put those into a bigger basket. And so my Fridays were BBQ big basket quizzes, and I would randomly choose 10. Now, it could have been anything from that week, the previous month, but I was incorporating retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and they had an opportunity for metacognition. Do they know it or not? Next. Retrieve taking. I was one of those students who, when I was sitting in a classroom, I would try to write down every single thing the teacher was saying, right? And my notes were horrible. I kept thinking, what am I missing? And by the end, they were a jumbled mess. I vowed I would never do that to my students. So retrieve taking, whatever we're doing in class, whether it's a clip, we're reading, PowerPoint, I'd simply stop, pause the lesson, close the book, blank slide, and have the students retrieve for 30 seconds, 90 seconds, whatever. Then you could either do a group share or a turn and talk, and you go right back to your lesson. In only 2 minutes, you have created a retrieval-rich classroom. Next.
Oh, trying to make notes. It's on the website though, so I shouldn't be doing that. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right there for you, Jake.
I was going to say it helps me remember, but.
So I also created what I call retrieval guides. And so for my 6th graders, this was the first time in our curriculum that they learned world history. And so here is an actual example of when we were talking about Ghana, where we would read part of the text, close the book, and then the students would complete the answers. They could be writing, they could be drawing, and then we would go over. I was able to circulate to make sure, the students were doing the work, and they were, because they become invested. And so the younger the students, the more guided you would want these to be. Next. For your older students, just giving them an outline. So I just, wrote 2 things about retrieval, but you leave those blank, and you are in total control as the teacher. You pause and then you give them the topic. That way your students can't work ahead because they don't know what the topic is going to be. And also when your students, when they know the routines, the procedures that you are going to stop and give them time, They aren't flustered about working ahead. They're with you. And so one of the beautiful things about a retrieval guide like this is by the end of class, they don't have a jumbled mess. You have ensured by giving them the topics that the most important information they have, and it's all organized, a beautiful way for them to study. Next. I created what I call the 4 steps of metacognition. I created this for several reasons. I wanted my students to be able to self-assess. I wanted them to have the tools to understand what they know versus what they don't. I'm going to go over this quickly and it'll make more sense the next slide. But the 4 steps are: make a judgment of learning. When you've got something in front of you, make that judgment. Do you know it or not? Star if you do, question mark if you don't. For younger students, a happy face. Let your class decide what marks they want to use. Step 2, and your books and notes are all closed. Step 2, answer all those that you know. Step 3, for the first time, open your notes, open your books, write down the correct answer. And step 4, verify that what you thought was correct was. Next slide. So I quit giving flashcards when I saw that my students were simply copying down definitions and not retrieving. Again, because this was the first time in the curriculum, I wanted my students to all be on the same page as far as similar definitions. So I created retrieval cards where I would give them the definition. Step 1, do you know it or not? Step 2, answer all that you know. Step 3, for the first time, open up your books and your notes, write down the correct answer. Step 4, verify that you indeed had the correct answer. Now, remember that example that I gave earlier about students who studied so hard for a test only not to do well? They were studying what they knew, right? But when you develop tools like this for your students, they automatically know this is where I need to focus my attention. Next. Other ideas, brain drains. Some people call them brain dumps. I always preferred brain drains. And what you see is a picture from my class where I gave them a sheet of paper that said, tell me about ancient Egypt. Well, you can see one person's, they wrote front, back, front, back, front, back. The only thing I would consistently hear was, oh, Mrs. Bain, the bell. I could have written so much more. When you give students an opportunity to write down what they know in a brain drain, it allows them to reflect. It allows them to make personal connections. Yes, tests are great. We come up with the questions, but what about all those things that your students learn that you didn't simply ask a question about, right? They still learned that information. Now, they could take an entire class like I did sometimes, or I might again stop and say, brain drain, let's go ahead and spend the next 90 seconds writing down what you thought was the most important. What is happening is you are having your students retrieve. Next. I also created what I call metacognition sheets. Now, these were something that I would give a few days before a test. And you can see it's the 4 steps: make your judgment of learning, answer what you know, look up what you don't, verify what you do. But you can see a real mix of questions, from simple recall, such as what's the definition of revolution, to a higher level. How did social pyramids change as a result of revolutions? Now, again, you have provided your students a tool that they can self-assess. You don't have to grade these. When your students know how to learn, they will want to do this because ultimately it saves them time in studying because they're able to pinpoint what they don't know. But I also don't believe in teaching to the test. So my students knew that just because something was on a metacognition sheet didn't guarantee it was going to be on a test. They knew I could really be spacing something for something coming along down the line. Metacognition sheets. Next. I also created power tickets because I wanted to create something that combined retrieval and spacing and interleaving and metacognition. So this is something great to do when you are getting ready for an end of semester or end of year test. What you can download at Powerful Teaching, it's blank across the top. I simply gave you an example. But as the teacher, you get to choose what the topics are. You can choose the topics, or you could use essay questions that you had used throughout the year. But what did we learn today, yesterday, last week, last semester? Give them the topics and have them retrieve. Now, with my 6th graders, what I would like to do is I would have them write down one fact. Tell me one fact about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, now turn to a neighbor and find a different one. Write that down. And then I would do a group share. And because everybody has it written down, you can call on anybody in class. They all have great answers. Or you could have your students do all 3. But you are providing all of those power tools. You are letting your students retrieve this information. Next. Power tools free you from grading. Harness them to maximize learning and minimize grading, not the other way around. You will always have grading of big ticket items, but allowing your students to practice these strategies all along the way lessens the daily grading for you, and it makes grading those big tests at the end so much more rewarding. Next. Can you go back? Nope, go ahead. So these were just some examples that I had talked about that you can find at Powerful Teaching. Next. So time to ponder again. I know I'm going through this quickly, but really I hope when this is over, I hope you will take a minute, 5 minutes, and really ponder, how can you start incorporating power tools into your teaching? When Pooja and I give talks, we always say, you do you. You know your curriculum, you know your students, you know your administration, you know your families. How can you tweak what is available and have it so it really maximizes the learning for your students? Next. What I found in my teaching is that it's not just the teacher and student. To me, the teaching triangle also included the parents. And as I have been speaking all over the place, too often I've had teachers say, I want to use power tools. I want to do this. I want my students to retrieve. I want to talk about metacognition. But I don't have time to meet with parents. How can I teach them about these things? How can I enlighten them? And so, first of all, when would I do it? I would do it at parent-teacher conferences. I'm not sure if you have them. I didn't talk about grades. I didn't talk about behavior. I talked about how their child learns. On the first night of parent night. I would give information about how we learn quickly, the power tools. And then as we started lockdown, you can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Before lockdown, in 2018, I did a nationwide in the United States survey, and I asked parents some questions. Next. I asked, what are the 2 top things that would help you with your child's learning? And the number 1 answer across the board was understanding the basics of learning. We now know so much. The other was, how do I help my child study? When is too much help? When is not enough help? We now know so much about the science of learning, but many of the parents who are educated but haven't been educated to the science of learning, they don't want their children to struggle, and their children don't have to struggle when we know how to use cognitive science. Parents want to know this. Next. Another question I asked, how important is it to you that your child's teacher uses research-based learning strategies? And the answer, they thought that was important. So now to my lockdown story. So as we started to lock down due to COVID, there's a fellow who lives over by you by the name of Ross McGill with Teacher Toolkit, who said, Patrice, of course he used a much better accent than I have. He said, Patrice, what are you writing? What are you working on? And my answer was, in my head, nothing. And that question spurred me on, because this book, next slide, had been brewing for years, at least 10 years, as I worked with parents, how I wanted to be able to get this information to them. So thanks to Ross and the time of COVID, I had time to start writing. And so John Catt Publishing, go ahead and click the next couple ones. It's going to be coming out this fall. I heard from them today, probably mid-November. It would have been out a little bit sooner, but due to people having to distance, not as many presses can be working at the same time. So it'll probably be out in November. It's a simple guide. It's less than 100 pages. It's less than $10. But I wanted a way for parents to understand. I want teachers to be able to have that triangle where it's a team working together. End of commercial.
Patrice, I can't put in. Is that like a Brad Clay exclusive reveal?
Well, I've kind of alluded to it a little bit on Twitter, but boom, it's out there now. The big reveal is November.
Right, sorry, I butted him. I think Dave did as well.
Oh, thank you for your enthusiasm.
Am I clicking forward? Sorry, I'm slowly getting used to when you're pausing for me to move it forward. I'm getting there.
So I also want to recommend Pooja Agarwal's site at retrievalpractice.org. She is an awesome cognitive scientist and my dear friend. And she takes what can be so complicated and makes it so user-friendly for us. She has written many practice guides. Some of them are listed here. She takes the latest research, puts it in chunks, so we have the time, we can understand it, and it's a great site for you to go to. And so, don't click anything yet.
Okay.
So you have seen this icon on practically every slide. And we were really intentional with this because the light bulb in the middle, it reflects learning. That's powerful, right? And the sparks coming out, that's learning, and that's powerful. And so we wanted to represent the 4 power tools. So retrieval, spacing, interleaving, metacognition. But there's 5 sparks. That big blue one that you see coming up, that's you. Because you have the power in your classroom to totally boost learning. You have the power to make learning so accessible for your students that it's not something that they're just going to do well on a test on Friday and poof, it's gone. But when we use the term lifelong learners, it's because what you're teaching them can be lifelong. Now you can click.
Oh.
You've got this.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, you've got this. Yeah.
Okay, so this was an adventure.
Yeah. Yeah. Goodness me, I can relax now. This is good.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
So if I stop sharing.
So let's have a chat. I was not keeping track of time. I probably went over what I did in the video. Once you get me talking, it's hard for me to stop. But let's go ahead and have a chat if you have any questions or.
Like I say, we're good with that, Patrice. You can talk for as long as you like. You know.
Well, we've had somebody's asked a question saying, well, one is from Helena. She said she absolutely loves it and thank you. And what's the parent guide going to focus on?
Parent guide pretty much is what I talked about today. The focus is retrieval, spacing, and metacognition. I didn't focus on interleaving because I think that's more teacher focused, but I gave hints for home, how to set up places for study, how to use retrieval in the car, you know, how to, when your students come home from school, what are questions to ask that will really promote retrieval of what happened. So it's really a guide that will help parents be that partner with school.
Cool. Unfortunately, Kat was unable to join us this evening.
Oh,
I know, but she has sent a question that she would like to be answered, though. And let me get Kat's question up. And Kat's was, she'd love to know what you think about what school leaders can do to avoid the key strategies that are in your book becoming lethally mutated by teachers who are keen to engage with evidence-informed strategies. So how do we avoid those lethal mutations?
Let's see. Of course, Kat would come up with a fabulous question. What I think has really excited me is the number of administrators that have read the book and contacted me. I have been thrilled with the school districts who have hired me to work with all of their teachers. So I think as your teachers and your administrators start learning the techniques, I think, how can I say this? There won't be any harmful mutations. I think once you can get people on board, and they're using the book and they're helping each other and they're using this in professional development, I think you'll have the teamwork. And especially when the administrators start seeing the results. I did not mention this earlier, but my classes, the averages were usually 96 to 98% A's. And I had all students, whether they were in special education, you know, I had them all. And these work. And when your administrators start seeing this type of success with students, they're going to support what works. It's what I've found.
Cool. I think it's that thing, isn't it, of just making sure it's explicitly low stakes. So I think like throughout your presentation, because I found it really interesting, the anxiety levels decreasing.
Yeah.
And I think it's that I think it just has to be so explicit that as soon as you attempt to turn it into something which isn't low stakes, well, then the anxiety is going to increase, and that's when the retrieval and the scores of your students are going to start to decrease.
Yeah.
Can I just ask on that note as well? Sorry, I'm just jumping in. So we take retrieval as that low stakes. So what do you do to ensure your students really understand that it's low stakes? So we can tell them that it's not being graded, we can tell them that it's for their benefit, but how do you really get that buy-in, and particularly with reluctant students? So for example, I use retrieval practice quite a lot, but there are still students who almost perhaps don't believe you that it is low stakes, that they still think that you're going to be judging them, there's going to be some kind of consequence regardless of what you say. So how would you deal with that?
Thank you, Lou. What I have found is, remember, I tell them on the first day, I'm going to teach you how to learn. And, I had all these years to develop these strategies. So my suggestion is to start slow. I didn't start with everything all at once. You start slowly. And your students, when you start giving mini quizzes, and then they take a quiz and they realize, I did really well on that, and then you start combining more, but you tell them why they did well. And so as you work it in slowly, you're not trying to trick them. I think they become very invested in the process because they see their own results. Now, when I did have these big tests, one of my questions always was, what strategies did you use? Which ones helped you and which ones didn't? And so you get the students to be invested to use these. Now, they would, metacognition sheets, they never even turned them in. There was no grade. Power tickets, they never turned them in. So on many of these things, if I use those 4 steps of metacognition, they were able to self-evaluate. Now, I would walk around and make sure they were doing that. Could they just not do it? Yeah. But who is that hurting? They would realize when they did them, they did really well on tests. And who doesn't want to succeed? But it's a process, a building process. And the students did well.
Thank you.
I think I'd not, listening to that, I think just little bits that I'd maybe not considered was actually, I can explain to them why we do retrieval. I'll explain it's low stakes. We'll do the low stakes. But actually that sort of analysis afterwards of almost saying to them, right, you have done well. Why have you done well? I'd not really considered that really slight detail, which is you're not questioning them at all, are you? You're not judging them in the slightest, but you're just getting them to say, yeah, actually, and building that.
I think Alex Quigley does something around well, he calls them tests rather. There's one blog that he's got on revision techniques, and he looks at exam wrappers, and he looks at those metacognitive questions in there. That's a really useful one.
Cool. Dave, do you want to take Kevin's question from the chat?
Yeah.
Because this links into Rose's a bit as well underneath, I think.
Yes, Kevin asked, well, he said, thank you, Patrice, for your presentation. May I ask how long it takes to instill this approach with a class of children? And dare I ask, can it be used with children of all ages?
Yes, with all ages. And again, you know, you do you. You're going to know your students best. I just suggest start small. You know, explain how you learn. Go with those 3 steps. Another universal question I would ask every year is, how many of you ever studied for a test? You studied really hard, but you didn't do well. And almost every hand goes up. That's like a universal. And I just say, there's a reason for that. Let me tell you what it is. And so as you work with your students and teaching them, it's going to, your pace, how much you can teach, the progress, that's going to be between you and your students. Just make sure that you help them understand each step along the way.
Oh. Right, I have a question as well, actually, and it's from something I read something I saw on Twitter the other day. What advice would you actually give to people that don't feel they can build retrieval into their lessons because they feel that it's going to take too much of the lesson away and they're tied by curriculum time? So
that is a question I get asked so often. It's like teachers are so inundated with how much there is to do, right? Sometimes it leads to difficult questions. When I first started with my job, I was to teach from early man to current times, 6 continents, to 6th graders, which is practically an impossible task, right? Do you want the breadth or do you want depth? And so I worked with my administrator on really taking a look at the curriculum guide. Let's identify those big ticket items. And we took a look at what was taught previously, what they needed to know for high school, and we were able to tailor that curriculum a little bit. So I think number 1, is there a conversation that can be had with administration at taking a look at the curriculum? Then number 2, do you want to cover everything or do you want your students to know things well? Those things that you want them to know well, retrieval and spacing, these things are key. I gave examples of how it could take only 90 seconds, but the difference in their learning is going to be huge, because whether you're going to cover information, but allowing them to retrieve it instead of just looking at it is going to make all the difference. Find a way to get those 90 seconds to be really effective.
Okay. Fantastic. Jake, you must have some questions.
Yeah, I always do. It was great, wasn't it? I loved it. Thank you. Just to quote, like, I loved it when you said, you know, these kids certainly secondary school, and this links in with Rose's point and also Kevin's as well. You know, should we be doing this with primary school students, and does it link in with them? You know, they come to secondary school and they feel like it's a party they weren't invited to. I mean, so if ever that was a call, you know, to do this with younger students, I think hugely important as well. Am I right in thinking on the website there's some stuff for early years foundation on there as well?
Yes.
Is that right? So that Rose, I'm hopefully that will link in with those questions that have been asked too.
Yes.
Yeah. And brain dumping and all of that. I love it. I love it. So during the brain dumping, then, could that be linked in with the retrieve taking? I love that as a
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just stop, pause the lesson, give them 30 seconds, 45 seconds, write down what you think was the most important. you can then just continue on. Or what I like to do was do a share and then a group share, because within a minute and a half, you have so many great ideas that other people are going, oh yeah, I could have written that. Oh yeah. So it just has this explosion of all great things being retrieved.
Yeah. No,
So, yes.
I love the brain dumps. I've used them this week, and again, it's the low stakesness of it. Just write down everything. Like, I've been teaching now for a week and a half. We've covered loads of stuff. Write it all down, what you can remember, and then we just moved on, and they loved it, because it was like, again, it wasn't like they couldn't get it wasn't a right or wrong answer for them. It was just a case of what they can remember. And it's like, see, you can remember stuff. It's, yeah. Love it.
So then it's like, you just retrieved. That's retrieval. Oh, and another thing too, when I would start out the new year, I always start where students could not fail. So, what is your favorite breakfast? What is your worst lunch? You know, having students just bring things to mind, share with a neighbor, group talk, and explain, that's retrieval. So I will do that for several days before I actually get into curriculum. So maybe I'm using whiteboards or a turn and talk, but I establish the procedures for retrieval and always start where they cannot fail. And that's another way to make sure that you get buy-in from all of your students.
Brilliant.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm just like hijacking this now. So you do some retrieval with them based on curriculum content. I'm just linking in with what you said as well, Lou. So we want them to have a sense of success, and that's obviously what builds or reduces the anxiety. Mm-hmm. So how do you then build that in to address misconceptions, anything that's been misremembered, say? How would you tackle that without denting confidence?
That is where my 4 steps of metacognition is so handy, because we all have had students or may know of people who are so convinced they're right? Mm-hmm. But they're not. And so that's why I made sure that 4th step in metacognition, the 4 steps, is to verify. Because sometimes students, I have seen it, they are so convinced that their answer is the correct one, and then, whoa, that isn't. Mm-hmm. And so, and especially when I don't have to grade those, but as they it helps them not internalize failure. It's like, oh, okay, well, I can switch that. Nobody else had to see that, but they were able to see that. Mm-hmm. And that's another reason why I would like to, the mini quizzes, I mean, all of these things, that feedback-driven metacognition, when the students can see, when it can be verified what they know versus what they don't. And when it's done low stakes, when it's done in an atmosphere of it's okay to make mistakes, they don't internalize failure. It's simply, oh, well, that wasn't right. You know, it just changes everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll read a note. So I don't think it's a question, but Catherine said she loves your enthusiasm. And how many times you say the same things, but it's just so open and you're just so keen for it all. Such simple and quick ideas, but also pointing them out for the children that they're doing retrieval. Lots of habits to make now, she said. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, brilliant.
Thank you.
So, Okay, have we got any more?
No, if anyone attending, if you've got any questions, just put them in now. We'll give it a couple of minutes, and then we can just open it up, can't we, or something? I don't know. We'll do that. Okay. I mean, if you could, Patrice, because interleaving and spacing is always it's one of those where I think someone will read about it and then they'll think they've got it and they'll go and do it, and they'll think they're doing spacing, but really it's interleaving or interleaving spacing. So if you could summarise the difference, just like in a few sentences or something, then we can capture that.
Well, to me, spacing is revisiting information. It's retrieval over time. And interleaving is different in that you are discriminating between similar topics. An example that I like to do when I'm talking is think of a fruit salad. That when you're making a fruit salad, you might put in strawberries and you might put in oranges and you might put in bananas, but you would not put in a tomato, even though a tomato is a fruit, right? When you're interleaving, you want to take your similar ideas, your similar topics. So, for example, when I'm talking revolutions, I can be talking about the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And I can ask a question about the Third Estate. Now, they had to think back to all of the revolutions they learned in order to answer a question about the Third Estate. That's interleaving. That's where you take similar concepts, topics, but they have to learn how to discriminate between how would I answer the Third Estate? How would that be different from working class? So they have to take that information and figure it out. Does that make sense?
Yes. Sorry, Rosa. I'll find the link for you and I'll post it in the chat box, just so you know that I'm sorting that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that's one of the biggest things that when we are talking about sort of the mutations, that seems to be one of the biggest ones I've seen. It's that misinterpretation of the spacing and the interleaving. So, and I think maybe sometimes they're not the appreciation of how powerful the spacing is. Mm-hmm. People sort of think that they're interleaving when they're spacing, and then they miss how powerful the actual spacing, the spaced retrieval is. So, yeah, fantastic. Dave, any questions?
There's just a couple of comments. Elena, this has been excellent, very useful. Intrigued by an approach aimed at parents. This would be so great. We could have an army of parents asking their children to retrieve every night. How powerful would that be? I actually said to our little girl earlier, I said, what have you been learning at school today? She said, I can't remember. What do you mean? I said, you've only finished school 2 hours ago. How can you not remember? So, wife pipes up and asks her to recount actually what she told her on the journey home. I think that's really powerful, isn't it? Like, just ask you, what have you learned today? What have you been learning about?
And some teachers, I've given talks, and some teachers have written to me and said that they've started incorporating that, where they will simply send home a couple questions to the parents and say, hey, ask about whatever. And they also provide the answer so that the parents can ask the students that. My battery is on low. So I might need to wind up or pause so I can go get my battery from another room. What shall we do?
Well, should we stop recording, and then Patrice, it'd be lovely if you could come back, because what we normally do now is we'll